is that it was a surprise Pearl Harbor-like attack, which was claimed to be a kamikaze plane attack, on the west outer wall of the Pentagon by Arab Muslim terrorists who, it is alleged, were in control of Flight 77, a large commercial 757 airliner, and the claim is at exactly 9:37 and 46 seconds, it diagonally penetrated through 3 of 5 rings to the inside of the middle ring only, causing a single exit hole on the inside of the middle C ring. So that is the official narrative of 9/11. Now this happens to be one of the images that you cannot see. This was simply an aerial of the Pentagon, and probably most of you do know. I was going to use my pointer here to show you exactly where the plane impacted, but for those of you who don't know, the west side of the Pentagon, the official story claims that Flight 77 came in at an oblique angle and did not hit the building straight on, but came in at an oblique angle, and parts of the plane, at least, it is claimed, went all the way through 310 feet. And according to Donald Rumsfeld, he made the claim that the nose of the plane poked itself out of the inside of the middle or C ring. Okay, that's the official story. Every part of this official story is not true. Now, what I'm going to do in these slides is where I am about to tell you where it isn't true, it's highlighted in red. So good, this is working. So the first claim is that it was a surprise Pearl Harbor-like attack. But the Pentagon, I now know from interviewing eyewitnesses, expected a terrorist attack on the building that morning, but with explosives of some kind. Bomb-sniffing dog teams were at the Pentagon Metro stop at least as early as 7:30 a.m. I've personally interviewed a Fort Monmouth TDY auditor named Michael Nielsen, as well as the very famous Army area survivor April Gallup, for 2 hours with under oath testimony on videotape. And they both stated that there were bomb-sniffing dog teams in the Metro stop at approximately 7:30 that morning, and then if they left the Metro stop, and presumably they were still there. So the Pentagon expected some kind of an attack, apparently with explosives that the dog teams were sniffing for that moment. Now, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, he's famous for his slips, but one of his slips is in this article. I have too many slides to give you the details, but the article is entitled, "Pentagon Attack Came Minutes After Rumsfeld Predicted There Will Be Another Event." That's Associated Press on 9/11, so that was obviously it was an online story. Now, I just would like you to know that based upon another very high-level interview I did, it is simply not the case, the 9/11 Commission claim that Donald Rumsfeld simply couldn't be found on 9/11. Nobody really believes that anyway, but I now have insider evidence from eyewitness testimony that that is in fact not true. Not only did Richard Clarke, in his book, Against All Enemies, make it clear, as Professor Griffin mentioned, that Richard Clarke was on the Clark's White House teleconference very early. In fact, he might have been the first or the second person on that teleconference. But I've personally interviewed the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations on 9/11. His name is Robert Andrews, and he stated in an article that was published on the official DoD website of the Naval Postgraduate School under my byline, which was totally vetted in advance and approved by him and his staff, that Rumsfeld went straight to Rumsfeld's Executive Support Center, or ECS, immediately after Rumsfeld heard that the second tower in New York was attacked, which would have been approximately right after 9/03, to join the Clarke White House teleconference. So it is simply not true that Secretary Rumsfeld could not be found on 9/11. So what was it that that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and the K-9 bomb sniffing teams expected to happen that morning, for whatever reason? Well, we have pretty good idea from one of the 9/11 Commission staff reports, the Team 8 report, which was the one that investigated the response, or I would say non-response, of NORAD on the morning of 9/11 and anything connected with the Pentagon. And they did an interview, many interviews, but one of them, and it's now released, you can see this entire report on the web from the National Archives release, that Captain Leidig, who on the morning of 9/11 was the acting head of the Military Command Center, quote, had no awareness of American Airlines 77 coming back to Washington, D.C. His first awareness of any problem was a call from Rumsfeld's own 3-star aide, that's a very high-level officer, who asked Leidig if he, Leidig, felt the explosion in the building, and asked Leidig to investigate it. Now here's another big hint. The FBI's official 9/11 investigation code name is Pent Bomb. Now, you heard this from Lori Van Auken in the very first testimony of these hearings yesterday. Now, what Lori mentioned on her videotape testimony was that the FBI had told her, as she recalled, that Pent Bomb that the bomb at the end stands for the exploding planes being used as bombs. But that is not what Monica Gabriel told me, another one of the Jersey girls. She told me that when they met with the FBI, that the FBI told them that all of the FBI investigations end in bomb. Well, this is blatantly false. The anthrax investigation of the FBI, for instance, is codenamed Amerithrax, not Ameribomb. So the FBI simply lied, apparently, to the Jersey girls. And interestingly, the Pent Bomb code name and the translation of the BOM in the code name for the word bombing was just the other day confirmed again by still FBI Director Robert Mueller in Time magazine just this May 9th. The FBI's SIOC Strategic Operations Center filled to capacity on 9/11 and remained that way through Pent Bomb, the FBI's cryptonym for Pentagon, Twin Towers, and bombing. Now that's very fascinating because the official story, of course, in the 9/11 Commission report and all the media that follows their lead is that bombs really weren't involved at the World Trade Centers or the Pentagon or any kind of explosives, secondary explosives on 9/11. So, back to the bottom part of the screen. You see at the bottom it says in red, inner wall of the C ring. It is simply not the case that whatever caused the damage on the inside of the Pentagon only penetrated to the inside of the C ring. It is simply not the case, as we are about to see. And that is the official story, that Flight 77 impacted the outside of the outside E ring, penetrated through the second D ring, and then penetrated parts of it somehow through, just poked its nose or something, some part of the plane, some heavy part of the plane through the inside of the C ring. But it's simply not true that that is the extent of the damage. There is, in fact, major damage and deaths in the innermost A and B rings of the Pentagon in the West section. For instance, in the A ring, I did, again, going back to the interview I did with Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations on 9/11, former top Army Green Beret officer Robert Andrews. He told me, quote, "My aide and I had to walk over dead bodies on the inside of the A ring. And I have brought with me my sworn testimony. I've done a jurat affidavit sworn testimony, which I will copy and provide to the panel from my entire testimony, but this is the gist and the nugget of that testimony. Secretary of Defense for Special Operations on 9/11, shortly after the second tower was hit, and before he ran up to join Rumsfeld in Rumsfeld's own video teleconference center across from Rumsfeld's own office, probably around 9:15 to 9:20 he got there, Rumsfeld was still, as he had been right after 9/03, on the teleconference, the White House teleconference with Richard Clark. And then we have Lisa Burgess, just one other example, Stars and Stripes reporter. She said, "I was walking on the Pentagon's innermost corridor across the courtyard when the incident happened. I heard two loud booms, one large, one smaller, and the shock wave threw me against the wall." So there were obviously violent events that were happening, although we don't know the precise time, and I will get into the critical evidence about the time of the real first violent event at the Pentagon a little bit later in my talk. The B ring. A Marine major to the Washington Post. This was in an article. And by the way, my paper for the panelists will be available to anyone after the presentation and after the hearings. And will have all of the references for you so you can see these quotes for yourself. So a Marine major to the Washington Post, that Post article shortly after 9/11, the B ring between the 4th and 5th quarters was decimated. Now the B ring is just second in from the inner courtyard. It's a whole ring in from the C ring. And we've already seen there were dead bodies and damage in the A ring as well, just inside the courtyard. The B ring between 4th and 5th quarters was decimated. The heat was so intense you couldn't go in. Marine Major to the Washington Post. The Pentagon Rescue Team testimony on 9/11. Quote, when we got into the building, we started to feel the heat right away, and as we walked deeper down the hallways, deeper means, and I've confirmed this with many people who work in the Pentagon, deeper means deeper towards the center, towards the courtyard, away from the alleged impact point. Further towards the center, it was just fire everywhere. Not so much smoke there, but fire all around us. You couldn't see the plane, just debris wherever you looked. In the C ring. Now the C ring is where the official story says the nose or some heavy part of the plane popped, just barely popped through the inside of the middle or C ring. But there is good evidence that that inner C ring, famous exit hole, was also made by some kind of explosives, probably shaped charge explosives that were put on the wall. This is one of many photographs that were originally from the Department of Defense that are available on the web. Mechanical engineer Michael Meyer has stated categorically, I'll give you his exact quote in a minute, that a round, clean, so-called, in quotes, exit hole is like the one seen here, at the inside of the C-ring, is the signature of a shaped charge explosive and definitely cannot be, he said it was impossible, from an impact from any kind of plane debris, nose, heavy piece, otherwise. Meyer spent years in aerospace, structural design, and the design and use of shaped charge explosives. He quote, it is physically impossible for the C-ring wall, the so-called exit hole, to have failed due to the impact of plane debris of any kind in a clean, neat circle like that. Shaped charge explosive, just so that you know, if you do the research on the web or in libraries, they can create a molten jet of plasma that can travel at up to 20,000 feet per second. Extremely fast. And there are witnesses, a number of them inside the Pentagon, you can you will read their testimonies in my paper, who described an incredibly fast-moving, they called it a fireball with a tail. Now, the next part of the official story of 9/11 at the Pentagon is, as I mentioned, that there was an oblique or diagonal impact on the outside of the outer wall of the west side, and that diagonally impacting plane and or parts of it after the first part of the penetration, this is the official story, penetrated through only 3 of the 5 rings. Now, and this is another one of my slides where you don't have the image, but that's okay. Because all it does is goes back to the original slide, which showed the impact, the approach of the alleged plane into the outside wall of the west side of the Pentagon. And I simply make the point that if a plane or any object, any impactor, would come in at an oblique angle, which the official story says, and goes diagonally through 3 rings, that you're not going to have a perfectly round exit hole. If it's the front of a fuselage or even a round engine, it would have to impact coming perpendicular to the wall. It would be an oblique type of hole. It wouldn't be perfectly round. That's another argument besides Michael Meyer saying that it is physically impossible. There is also many witnesses to absence of plane debris outside the C-ring exit hole, despite the official claims. For instance, Terry Mitchell of the Audiovisual Division of ASDPA, quote, I didn't see any evidence of an aircraft down there. Now, this is a slide that I will be able to show you. If any of these slides just come up afterwards during a break, and I will show you the actual images on my PowerPoint, and that would be for any of the panelists as well. But what this is simply, it's an image taken as a screen capture from the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, report. It's called the Building Performance Report, the after-action report by engineers on the damage at the Pentagon, how it held up, what columns were destroyed, what columns were damaged, etc. And this is simply a graphic of those columns that, from their analysis, going in about 3 days at least after all the debris was cleared out, so that they could see the columns standing or not, that it's a graphic of where the intact columns still were. And one of my colleagues Former NASA Director of Research Engineering, Dwayne Dietz, did a very simple analysis of this graph, and he showed that there is at least one, if not more than one, intact column in any straight line through anywhere near where the alleged entrance hole is and the alleged exit hole. So it's physically impossible for any solid object, large and heavy solid object, to have penetrated and made that exit hole. It would have hit at least one of the columns. And besides, the ASCE report itself states that from its own analysis of the evidence of the damage at the Pentagon, that they don't believe that any part of the plane, if there was a plane, survived more than 160 feet in, and the alleged exit hole diagonally now is about 311 feet in. And I would just like to make an aside here. The Pentagon Performance Report by the American Society of Civil Engineers has this caveat at the beginning, of the very beginning of the report. Quote, "The ASCE makes no representation of any kind concerning the accuracy or completeness of any information contained in this publication." Unquote. So if you still have confidence in anything the Pentagon report says, see me afterwards. Okay, now this is a very incriminating evidence for the official story. By the way, the official story at the Pentagon can totally collapse on any one of these points, let alone all of them taken together. All right, so we're back to our official story, and in red, you see that the official story, of course, says that there is a single exit hole on the inside of the C ring, caused by whatever. Well, in fact, this is a graphic taken from the Washington Post immediately after 9/11 from Pentagon sources, DoD sources itself. And when you come up afterwards, you can see the key, if you can't see it there, but there are 3 exit holes listed from the Pentagon's own immediate sources to the Washington Post after 9/11, not just one. And now we're going to see the image. Luckily, this image survived into my PowerPoint today. This is an aerial photograph that the Pentagon provided to all the media right after 9/11. You can see it on the web. And now hopefully my pointer, yes. This is the so-called official exit hole right here. But there are 2 others that in turn perfectly match these 3 so-called exit holes from the Pentagon's own release data, and here it says exit holes, plural. And those positions match. So it is impossible for there to have been 3 C-ring exit holes to have been caused by any kind of an impactor or penetrator, regardless of what it was. Now, eyewitnesses to inside explosions in the outer 3 rings of the Pentagon. We're going to start with the outside E-ring, which the official story says a plane impacted. April Gallup, a very famous witness. I have done a 2-hour under oath videotaped interview of April Gallup. In that under oath 2-hour sworn statement to me, she states, and I'm summarizing, of course, there were huge explosions the second that she, April Gallup, hit the on button on her computer in the E-ring. She said, "I thought it was a bomb." There were 2 explosions. You saw earlier there was another witness who said there were two loud sounds, 2 explosions. She walked out of the alleged entrance hole, according to the official story, and yet saw no plane parts, no seats, no passenger, no luggage, no smell of jet fuel, no jet fuel fire, no burns on her body. The only fires she saw were seen coming out of the computers in a large ring around her large Army work area. And there was a similar experience reported by Tracy Webb, for instance, in the D ring, with computers being destroyed. And April Gallup walked out of the alleged entrance hole, according to the official story, with only 1 shoe, 1 bare foot, and the floors were not hot, she said, and her soles, as you will see now, are completely unburned. April Gallup resting on the Pentagon lawn after walking out of the alleged impact hole with 1 bare foot and her soles completely unburned. Others in her group, let me explain what I mean by that. April Gallup has a group of other survivors of the Army area and close to it whom she meets with. I have not interviewed those people, but I believe her. And hopefully, in the next hearing that we have, where we can put hopefully witnesses under oath, that some of those brave witnesses will be able to come forward. Other witnesses who work close to the official story impact area, whom Gallup meets with in the Washington, D.C. area where she lives, quote, did not see anything of this nature as well. I have not talked to anyone yet who said that, which means they saw evidence of any parts of a plane or anything related to a plane inside that area of the building. Documentary producer Judy Rothschild was allowed inside access shortly after the attack. Quote, there weren't seats or luggage or things you find in a plane. Now, high-level reports. By high-level, I mean high-level officials and highly credible witnesses. Reports of inside explosions at the Pentagon. The acting head, as we've seen, of the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon itself, Captain Leidig, was asked if he felt an explosion in the building by Rumsfeld's own top aide. Naval Command Center, first floor, D ring. D-ring, again, is the second ring in from the outside. Quote, Lieutenant McGowan, it sounded like a series of explosions going off, a series of bombs exploding, similar to like firecrackers when you light them. You just get a series going off. Bum, 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 which reminds you of the testimony of some of the Naudet brothers in the Naudet brothers' famous video of the World Trade Center when he says it felt like bum, 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 bum. Lieutenant Kevin Schaefer, the entire command center, he's referring to the Naval Command Center. The entire Naval Command Center, which was in the West Wedge first floor, exploded in a gigantic orange fireball. I felt myself being slammed to the deck by a massive and thunderous shock wave. Additional witnesses and evidence to inside explosives. Army Fort Monmouth Auditor Michael Nielsen, I've mentioned him before. Hundreds raced down the hall past me and out the south side exit shouting, it's a bomb, bomb, it's a bomb. And multiple witnesses smelled cordite, which is definitely not jet fuel, doesn't smell anything like it. Inside explosives would explain why there was no advanced siren or evacuation, which was one of the complaints in April Gallup's lawsuit against Rumsfeld, Cheney, and Myers. There was no seismic signal from any kind, no significant seismic signal from any impact at the Pentagon anywhere close to it from between an hour before the alleged official story time and 1 hour after. And let me just point out that at the official narrative states that there was a over 2 Richter scale seismic signal for alleged impacts, allegedly from impacts of planes dozens and dozens and dozens of stories high in the World Trade Center buildings, but no comparable significant signal at the Pentagon when the official story of 9/11 says that a huge 757 airliner impacted just above the ground. There's the seismic record. It is impossible for foreign terrorists to have planted explosives inside the Pentagon in any ring. The official story collapses. Therefore, foreign terrorists did not attack the Pentagon. The official story is false. Unlike a blunt instrument of a plane, inside explosives enable the targeting of specific offices and functions. I'm going to quickly skip over this. It will be in my slides for the panelists and anyone who wants to see it, because I see I have to go quickly to my conclusions. So the Naval Command Center was almost certainly targeted. The Washington Post said so immediately after 9/11. We know the part that was targeted. It was the intelligence center in this upper corner, which is, this is taken from here. That's that corner right there, and that's that corner, the intelligence cell. Interestingly, the only survivor according to the official story, the only survivor of the Naval Command Center, which was almost certainly targeted by inside explosives, on the morning of 9/11, Navy Lieutenant Kevin Schaefer became the top staffer on the key Team 8 staff subgroup of the 9/11 Commission investigating the Pentagon's own attack and NORAD's non-response. And then these are many other survivors, NCC survivors, censored from the official story. He was, in fact, not the only one. And I have that from an interview I did with the commander, the person who was in command of the Naval Command Center on 9/11 itself, at Rear Admiral Hathaway. I'm going to skip over this, but it was my original research putting together the dots, connecting Donald Rumsfeld's acknowledgement to the press and in congressional testimony the day before 9/11 that the Pentagon seemed to be missing $2.3 trillion. That's like 2.3 times the entire expenditure so far on the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. That's, you know, a lot of money to just not be able to find. We do know that that there were definitely a large number of Army auditors and financial management people who were killed in the Army administrative area close to where April Gallup's desk was on the morning of 9/11. The question is, was that another targeted attack? Very important point. Once you realize that the real story inside the Pentagon on 9/11 is inside explosives, and that inside explosives not only can be targeted, they are targeted. It's not a blunt instrument of a plane coming from the outside that might or might not hit as low as the ground level without breaking up or something else. Once you realize they're inside targeted explosives, then the light goes off and you can look at other areas that were targeted and why. Same as Professor Zerbegka pointed out, that there might have been reasons to target the particular floors with airplanes and perhaps inside explosives as well at the World Trade Towers on 9/11. Outside terrorists would have targeted the Pentagon roof, obviously, and easier to hit command areas, for instance, where Rumsfeld and Myers worked. Not the National Command Center, or the Naval Command Center, not the CNO Intel plot, which is another apparently targeted offices, or even the sparsely populated entire West Wedge, where the official story says that a plane impacted at almost ground level, because that's precisely the one side of the 5 sides of the building, the approaches to the building, that had the most physical obstacles in the way. A hill, an antenna, light pole, cyclone fence, and large cable spools that are in advance. The government lied about inside explosions. Do you think it's telling the truth about the one and most famous outside explosion in the 5 famous frames from the 2 videotapes of the security cameras in the parking lot of the Pentagon, that the videotapes were released in the Moussaoui trial in August of 2006? Probably not, and in fact, we know not. And how do we know not? It's the wrong date. Has anyone ever noticed that security camera video says September 12th? It is also the wrong time. Now, it is important to know that that is one of the 5 famous leaked frames. Those were leaked in early 2002, and the Moussaoui trial didn't release the videos of which these 5 famous frames were taken in one of the 2 videos that were close to each other in the parking lot until the Moussaoui trial in 2006. Okay, so what we do know is that the wrong date is on the leaked slides, which we do know that these 5 slides, or these 5 frames, came from one of those 2 security camera videotapes in the parking lot that were released 4 years later in the Moussaoui trial. But when they were released in the Moussaoui trial, there is no date. So if you were going to, why would someone put out the famous 5 frames with the wrong date if they were trying to support the official story? And yet this is the image in 2002 that was on the front page of every newspaper in the world, allegedly proving that the Pentagon was indeed struck on 9/11. And of course, as we all know, these frames do not include any image of a plane. The 85 videos that were confiscated by the FBI, there was an FOIA request. The FBI FOIA officer was honest and did an analysis of those 85 videotapes and came back to the person who requested it, just a regular citizen like you and me, who we can all put in FOIA requests, and the analysis came back from the FBI itself that there were only 2 of the 85 that in any way could be interpreted as showing an impact on the building, and those are the 2. And we know that they do not prove anything. They have the wrong time stamp, the wrong date stamp, and they do not show a plane. So I'm just going to close. In my presentation, there is proof that the official story time of the attack on the Pentagon, which was taken from the flight data recorder, which is almost 9:38, is flatly false. I have independent, compelling, converging lines of evidence from clocks, April Gallup's stopped wristwatch, and many, many, many other witnesses and physical evidence that the first violent event at the Pentagon happened over 6 minutes earlier, just after 9:30. So, in conclusion, the official story at the Pentagon completely collapses on any single one of the data points that I have proven to you today, in my opinion, that you tell me if you think I've proven my case. It collapses on any single one, and I believe I've already shown you at least a dozen of those. So what does that mean? The bottom line is, I've been able to show you that the official story at the Pentagon is false without even having to address the question of if there was a plane, what path the plane came in on, etc. You don't need to even address that controversy that still exists in the 9/11 truth movement. We can have consensus that the real story of 9/11 at both the World Trade Center and the Pentagon is in fact inside explosives. Thank you very much.
For a very stimulating presentation. We will now move to what I'm afraid is going to be a rather abbreviated question period, but do please begin your questions, panelists.
And I will be happy to answer questions at the end of the day.
Professor Lee.
Very quickly, and thank you for an absolutely stunning presentation.
Thank you.
Tons of new material.
Microphone.
Mike.
Oh, sorry. Are you saying that the explosions went off several minutes before the alleged impact of the alleged aircraft?
Yes, absolutely, and you will see that in my PowerPoint and my paper that will follow. Yes, here's an example. Let me just, in answering your question, I'm glad you asked it. The actual violent time was when April Gallup's, of the first violent event, was when April Gallup's wristwatch went off. It stopped. She has it in her safe deposit box just after 9:30. This is also true of the heliport clock, of the clock in the Naval Command Center in the Navy area. There you see the clock from the heliport right after 9:30, clock from the Pentagon. And the bottom line is, I've even interviewed Alberto Gonzalez. I have him on audio tape telling me the attack happened right after 9:30. The official FAA timeline says right after 9:30. But our famous 9/11 Commission report says that the attack time of Flight 77 was at 9:37 and 46 seconds.
Yes, Professor Johnson.
Thank you. From your presentation, do we gather that you not necessarily agree with the notion that a plane actually hit the Pentagon? We were shown pieces of aircraft on video, on television. We were shown pieces of the engine on the ground. We were shown a part of the tail, presumably it was part of the tail. How were these things spread around before the attack? I'm still very confused about that. And also, we had some experts...
Could I answer one at a time?
Yes.
Because my memory isn't that great. Okay. I will preface my answer by saying that my brief today, my mandate, was to address the explosions inside the Pentagon, the proof that they happened at least 6 minutes before any impact, or no matter what it might have been or could have been. So I hope that I have demonstrated that. Okay. Given that I've demonstrated that, you would be asking me for my educated guess, my opinion. Would you like me to give you my opinion as to whether a plane hit the Pentagon?
Please do.
I do not. The evidence is simply not there that a 757 of any kind hit the Pentagon, in my opinion.
Which means that the debris that was spread around was planted.
No, not necessarily. It could be from something else. But the important message of my presentation is that if we want a consensus approach going forward for the 9/11 truth movement, there is tremendous and in some cases very toxic personal controversy and debate over whether there was a plane and what kind of a plane and what path the plane came in on. We don't have to go there in order to prove that the official story completely collapses.
Thank you so much.
Professor Jenkins.
Well, I think it might still be useful to go there because of public perceptions. I mean, somehow, if there are many eyewitness accounts of planes of the size of the Boeing 757 going into the Pentagon, we have to deal with that, do we not?
We do, and you would have to talk to the people who organized the conference. I'd be happy to do that talk later.
Thank you.
We'll do it in D.C.
Okay. He said we'll do it in D.C. There's going to be a conference on the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. in the not-too-distant future.
Can I ask the audience, please, to hold comments until a question is made?
Any other questions from the panel? No, yes.
Your reconstruction of the events is very impressive. Was the information gathered from actual witness present to the events? Were they all on the oath yesterday?
On the what? On the what?
Under oath.
Oh, were they under oath? Mm-hmm. Good question.
And
I'll answer that one. Okay. My research is a combination, of course, of scholarly research, looking at the evidence, and I must say one of my major sources is the best in the world, Professor Griffin's books. But also going to original sources, published sources, the original newspapers, the magazines, and then that gives you ideas as to who to interview. But I was the senior military affairs journalist at the Department of Defense's senior Science, Technology, and National Security Affairs University for 15 years. And during that period, I used that access to interview the actual principals. In the case of April Gallup, whom I consider the most important witness, the woman who was literally, her desk was, according to the official Pentagon Building Performance Report itself, only about 35 to 40 feet from the alleged entrance hole of anything hitting the building, whatever it might have been. And she saw no plane parts, no luggage, nothing, wasn't burned. I have done a 2-hour under oath, videotaped, sworn testimony of April Gallup.
We are.
He had one follow-up question, and then we could.
Please, a follow-up. Yes.
there are survivors at Pentagon that we can.
I don't understand.
Survivors.
Oh, survivors?
Survivors. There are survivors that you know that we can meet as witness.
There are, whether they would be willing to or not, they would have to be promised security. Yes, but yes, I know who they are. Thank you. So.
No, please. We do have time for further questions.
Oh, okay.
Please continue. Yes.
All right.
Yes, until Richard Gage arrives, at which point we will.
Oh, fine. You can continue with questions if you'd like.
Yeah.
Oh boy, he says.
Professor Lee, you have something further.
I mean, you had some amazing slides, which I'm sure we're going to have a chance to study in great
Yes.
detail.
And there are many more. I was able to give you half of my presentation.
But some of them were whizzing by at a great rate. And I find it intriguing that the official Pentagon photograph from the air shows 3 exit holes in Ring C.
Correct.
And has no one, thought to comment on that?
I did. I discovered it. Well, put it this way. Many people have noticed that there were the 3 holes with, the big black smoke around them. But it was, to my knowledge, I'm the first person who put together the Pentagon's own data to the Washington Post right up the day after 9/11 that was published, with showing 3 exit holes.
Yes.
And they're in precisely the same positions. You see, what's important, and the same thing is true of the time, and you will see this from my slides in the whole section proving that the original reports, all the original reports, were that whatever the violent event at the Pentagon was, and they of course weren't sure at the beginning, people on the outside in the media, they were all right after 9:30. 9:30, right after 9:30, shortly after 9:30, April Gallup's watch stopped right after 9:30, all the clocks stopped right after 9:30, and then the government needed, for some reason that we're still trying to figure out, to say that the Pentagon was attacked by a Boeing 757 almost 6 to 7 minutes later. It's very important for them that we don't believe that something happened right after 9:30, but it did, and I've proven that it did.
Thank you very much, Barbara
Thank you.
Honegger. At this point, I regret I'm going to have to draw this session to a
No,
close and bring on our next speaker.
So thank you.
A very brief announcement. Anyone here the owner of a Honda Civic Gray parked outside, license plate BCUS 856? Could you please contact Professor Witt? I have also another quick announcement to make having to do with the, because of our very compressed schedule this afternoon, we're going to have to, I regret, shorten the audience Q&A today. We'll try and compensate on our two succeeding days. It's therefore particularly important that we start with written questions and in the order that they're submitted. So could you please pass in written questions to us during the coming break. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Richard Gage. Richard Gage is a San Francisco Bay Area architect and a member of the American Institute of Architects. He has been an architect for more than 23 years and has worked on most types of building construction, including, this is important, numerous fireproofed, steel-framed buildings. Since founding Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth in 2006, Richard Gage has presented Blueprint for Truth all over the world, and he has made many television and radio appearances. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth now includes more than 1,500 licensed and degreed architects and engineers, all of whom are calling for a new investigation into the events at the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Richard Gage will present to us the evidence for the demolition of the World Trade Center buildings, an overview. Richard.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here in Toronto and at the Toronto hearings, where we've assembled to look at the evidence, package it, and make sure it gets used by the media, by governments, and by individuals all around the world. I represent 1,550 architects and engineers now, calling for a new investigation of the destruction of these towers. Why? Because the evidence shows, and as I believe you'll see today, that all three skyscrapers were destroyed by explosive controlled demolition. How do we know that? Because we are using the scientific method to figure out what happened that day. And in the next hour, we're going to use it in a way that NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, never did. That we're going to show you several holes in their work, particularly tomorrow with John Cole and Kevin Ryan. You've already seen some of the problems associated. So we're going to apply the scientific method. We formulate a question. How did the towers come down? We do some background research. This gives us a means of developing a hypothesis, our best guess as to what happened. Based on that research and those observations, we take our best guess. I think fire or jet plane impacts brought the towers down. Maybe controlled demolition brought them down. We don't rule out anything until the evidence itself rules it out. We test that hypothesis with experiments, and we analyze the results and draw conclusions. Now, if the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. And this is one of the chief failings of the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Transparency. And this is because the body of work can be built on by many to yield even increasing and compounding results and levels of accuracy. Now, if the hypothesis is not corroborated, what do? We go back, we find a hypothesis that does stand a better chance of being supported by the evidence. This has been around for about 100 years or more, the scientific method. It works pretty well when it's used. So let's apply it. Let's start with some background research. What are the forces that destroy buildings? This is real basic. You can do this in the 7th grade. Fire destroys buildings, certainly. Okay? And we have earthquakes, natural forces, which cause organic asymmetrical collapses, as you'll see. Explosions certainly destroy buildings. And of course, explosions can be harnessed in controlled demolitions to destroy buildings quite efficiently. Now, the really neat thing about these forces is that they're very different from each other. They're easily distinguishable. And so this job actually gets pretty easy. Let's start with fires. Fire is an organic process. It moves through a building every 20 minutes or so. Burns out one area, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a building falls due to fire, and by the way, you'll note that never before in the history of skyscrapers have we lost one due to fire. But say in a wood frame building, the building will begin to fall over asymmetrically, not straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. But it's an organic process. It's chaotic. There'll be large deformations and so forth. So we know, we see how buildings fall due to fires. How would a building react that is steel framed, though, to a fire? Let's see.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I had not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Not till recently have we seen a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire. Recently means on 9/11, when we have not one, not two, but three collapsing. Counter to the experimental data produced in the UK by Cardington tests, which show that without fireproofing, these steel structures do not collapse. We're talking about a 3 or 4 inch sag, that's all. We have over 100 examples of very hot, large, and long-lasting fires in steel frame skyscrapers. Not one of them has ever collapsed. For instance, the 6-hour fire over 5 floors in New York. In LA, 3.5 hours over 5 floors. In Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. And in Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. Not one of these has ever collapsed. Now, here is some mid-rise buildings that have collapsed due to earthquakes. In this case, we have the building falling over to the path of least resistance. It's a chaotic process. Note that you can see at the bottom on the ground what was a building. It's recognizable as a building. The structural steel components have not dismembered from each other. The concrete is not pulverized to powder. This is really important because when we look at the 3 high-rises on 9/11, we see something quite different. Prepare yourself. These buildings were blown up with explosions. There's thick, billowing, enormous clouds of pyroclastic-like smoke with suspended solids from the pulverized building materials and concrete. The word pyroclastic comes from volcanoes, which has that characteristic, which tremendous amounts of solids are suspended in the air, with a very thick edge outline, distinguishable from this solid-like mass that has a cauliflower-like shape that is expanding due to the incredibly hot gases, much hotter than office fires, for instance, can produce. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these things, you know you have explosions. Note that explosions are not a part of the official story, except for the initial jet plane impacts, of course, in the Twin Towers, which happened an hour to an hour and a half before the collapse of these buildings. Let's take a look at controlled demolitions, where explosions can be harnessed quite efficiently. We have hundreds of examples from all across the country from which to make our comparison, because this is how we use explosives to demolish high-rises. So this is what a high-rise looks like while it's being demolished with explosives. Controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways. Normally the purpose is to bring a structure down while avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and to do so quite efficiently. Economically too. Typically a tall building like these are demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and then detonating them in a very precise order, progressing outward and upward, synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the inner columns allows the weight of the building to pull the exterior inward, and destroying the building from the bottom up allows the weight of the building to be harnessed to do some of the destruction. So the result is an implosion like you see here, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse at nearly freefall acceleration into a consolidated rubble pile that's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Now this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish. And fire, by the way, never has. So what are the typical features? We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the building. We have a straight down symmetrical collapse, often into the building's own footprint, because demolition waves remove the column supports in a synchronicity. We have a free fall speed, sometimes, through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel in the way. And we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure, broken up, ready for loading and shipment. There's minimal damage to adjacent structures, And there's sounds of explosions heard by witnesses. There's flashes of light seen by witnesses. Enormous clouds of pulverized concrete and pyroclastic smoke. Squibs sometimes, or isolated explosive ejections that are seen in various parts of the building that are obviously explosions. And of course there's chemical evidence left behind in the residue of cutter charges. If you have these things, any of these features, you know you had an explosive demolition. If you had all of them, you are really, really, really sure. There's no question. This is direct evidence of explosive destruction, and guess what? Fire cannot create any one of them, let alone all 10 of them. Okay? If we're aided in addition to that with government support, they've documented it in various ways. I mean, after all, you have to apply for permits for an explosive demolition, and often there is helpful documentation. Experts agree. Those without an axe to grind or a behind to cover will agree. It's a controlled demolition. Foreknowledge. These are planned months in advance. It's a huge job, and millions of dollars companies make on each one of these. So we know in advance. If you have foreknowledge, you're pretty sure it was a controlled demolition. Video documentation helps too. This is proof of a controlled demolition. So we're setting the stage, as you can see here, to try to make our effort today quite easy. Now we're going to apply that effort and that set of criteria to the third worst structural failure in modern history that most every architect and engineer in the United States and around the world know nothing about, which is in and of itself a huge curiosity at least, and more to the point, what amounts to a cover-up, censorship by the media, who knew and reported that day that this building was destroyed. In fact, it was destroyed at 5:20 in the afternoon after the Twin Towers came down. This is a 47-story skyscraper that is a football field in length away from the North Tower. Of course, it was not hit by an airplane, so we don't have the propaganda, the baggage that we have with the Twin Towers, because we all know how they came down, jet plane impacts and fires, or so we're told. So here's the building, bright and shiny, in the morning of 9/11, and it continues to stand after the Twin Towers came down. It suffered some small fires here and there. I'll show those to you. What we're going to do is apply that set of criteria to Building 7 and see if any of them fit. Let's begin. Is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Let's listen to Dan Rather narrate this as we take what may be our first look at World Trade Center 7's collapse.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now we're going to videotape the collapse of this building. That's a good job. It's an amazing, incredible picture work. For the third time today, just reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much of those before, but the building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Well, Dan's using his intuition here to describe what he's saying, and of course that's what we should all be doing. The problem is that Dan never talked about this building again after the first day. He must have been quite curious about it after describing it as a controlled demolition, basically, well-placed dynamite. And the media never played this, with very, very few exceptions, if you can count on half of a hand, 3 or 4 times. So that's a real problem for many of us. Is there a straight down symmetrical collapse of this building into its own footprint? Let's look from West Street. pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Watch the penthouse this time. It collapses about a half a second early. Let's bring it back up. We'll be talking about why that penthouse came down. Notice the classic V formation in the top of that view, and that is why would that be done? Remember, taking the inside out first brings the walls inward. I'm not quite convinced yet, though. Let's look at side-by-side comparison here. On the left is World Trade Center 7. On the right is a known controlled demolition. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Particularly given that every high-rise that has come down with explosives, and that no high-rise has ever come down due to fires. Shouldn't NIST have used their first hypothesis should have been destruction with explosives? Maybe, if not their only one. This is how obvious this becomes. Now, these are the fires that are alleged to have brought that building down. There's a couple on this side, there's a couple on the other. NIST claims there was 8 to 10 of them in various floors. None of them were larger than what you see here. And those fires are said to have caused the beginning of this building on the beginning of the destruction of this building on the 12th floor. And yet those fires were out an hour before this building came down. So the thermal expansion theory, this new phenomenon NIST came up with to try to explain this to the American people with their fancy computer models that you've heard about and you'll be hearing more of, starting with column 79 because it's under the east penthouse, which falls 6 seconds prior to the overall collapse of this building. So you might have heard already that there was some damage from the North Tower. Presumably that's the debris from the North Tower. Presumably that's how the fires had started, although the worst fires were all the way on the back side of the 12th floor, which interestingly enough was occupied by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases it was actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. But I didn't say that. Let's take a look at something more interesting, in fact, than that even. This is NIST's computer model. Compare it to reality. What do you see? I'll point out about 6 things that I see. First of all, it stops 2 seconds into the overall collapse. Why? Well, as you can see, it begins to tip over. Had they gone, they can't even get their own computer models to reflect the straight-down symmetrical collapse of an engineered patterned set of explosives. And you can see massive bulging and indentation at the bottom, which is not reflected at all in the perimeter steel frame skeleton of the building. What else do you see? We have a massive set of failures of connections of structural steel framing that amounts to a rate of about 400 per second failing, beginning here, and look, almost instantly all the way up the building. Structural engineers will tell you that an isolated failure in a structural steel system cannot cause an instantaneous set of failures vertically throughout the building. And then NIST claims, well, then that travels laterally. But they don't even show us that. But forget that. Just the fact that we have massive failures in the structural system throughout the height of this building in the first few seconds before the overall collapse, wouldn't you expect to be seeing that reflected all the way up to the top and breaking massive numbers of windows on the side? How many windows do you see breaking here? a couple. They should all be tearing apart, massively warping. This is a real problem for NIST. I don't know why they couldn't have done better in terms of reflecting what actually happened after all. They manipulated it 6 ways from Sunday from the beginning anyway. Why not go all the way? The building failure looks nothing like their model, and it falls nearly into its own footprint. The center of the pile is in the center of the building, indicating symmetrical damage. How does that happen? How do you get that level of symmetry in the destruction of this building? Let's take a look at the floor plan. Maybe we can get some clues. If we don't take out all 24 core columns and all of the 50 or so perimeter columns at once, virtually simultaneously, what's going to happen? That building is going to fall to the path of least resistance. Asymmetrically, it'll fall over. That's how, and in controlled demolitions, if they have any degree of variation in the split-second timing of those explosives, they all have to go off within about 1/10 of a second of each other. The building tips over, and there are plenty of examples of failed controlled demolitions that do just that. So the question is, can fire accomplish that level of precision? All at once, all over the floor plan, and then synchronistically timed for a number of floors amounting to about 8. These 8 stories here, according to NIST, well, after members of 8 Unite on Truth that you'll be hearing from tomorrow cornered NIST and secured their acknowledgement, their admission, that indeed this building did fall at free fall. You're going to learn about free fall tomorrow from a physicist, from a physics teacher, David Chandler. But for right now, look at the geometry of the building's collapse. It's coming down faster and faster. Each second, there's more speed, indicating gravity is in full control here. It's falling as fast as a bowling ball dropping off the side of the building. Tomorrow we'll learn the implications of that. But they are severe, and NIST has much to account for here. Do we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure? Remember, this was a 47-story steel frame, moment-resisting building with very rigid column to beam connections. They're welded, collapsing to a pile only 4 stories high. And that pile, if it was going to collapse, should have been about 20 stories high. Masses of buildings. Remember, buildings that fall due to natural forces, they fall over the path of least resistance. There's massive building left. It's not dismembered into its individual components. It doesn't collapse like a house of cards. Do we have minimal damage to adjacent structures? Indeed. It appears to have been a good job. Maybe I could have done better myself. I could have avoided damage to this building and this one. Just kidding, I don't know how to do this. Do we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions? Let's listen to Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic and first responder at the scene.
And then it was like another 2 to 3 seconds. You heard explosions. Like, and it's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compressor, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was like you felt a rumble on the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
That's interesting testimony. What about Barry Jennings, who was a manager on the 23rd floor of this building, not having gotten the word that the building was evacuated? He goes back up in after everybody else is evacuated. What did he experience?
We got to the 8th floor. I started walking to one side of the building. The side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing. When we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions. Up to the 7th.
suspected A4.
When we get outside, police officer comes to me and says you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
All this information of bombs, not only in the World Trade Center, but in Building 7, but in the Twin Towers as well. Surely all of these reports of explosions were taken in by the incredible job that NIST did interviewing thousands of witnesses and reporting on these. No, not one of these explosions are a part of the official story, which is quite disturbing. How about this one?
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, you want to call your mother or something?
The afternoon of 9/11. Not a part of the official story. Wouldn't we be curious about that? Do we have enormous clouds of pyroclastic-like smoke and dust? Look at this incredible level of expanding gaseous clouds racing 35 miles an hour in every direction away from the destruction of Building 7. And with a thick edge and complete set of pulverized solids filling this, this cloud of smoke. Much hotter than a few small office fires that you saw fueling that cauliflower-like expansion of that cloud. Do we have enormous... Oh, this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. And I'm going to leave for you the evidence of cutter charges for tomorrow. There's lots to share there. But for right now, that's a lot of direct evidence, and guess what? None of those can be created by fire, let alone all 8 of them. In fact, if one of the World Trade Center buildings was to fall due to fire, we would expect it to be World Trade Center 5, which was completely engulfed. And did it collapse? No. Mid-rise, high-rise office buildings do not collapse due to fire. There's 40,000 tons of steel in World Trade Center Building 7. That steel, fireproofed or not, will draw that heat away from its source and distribute it out through that incredible heat sink. Let's take a look in Beijing, where we had a massive fire fully engulfing a 44-story skyscraper. And surely this one is going to collapse. Did it? No. Before on the left, after on the right, the building is still standing. And yet, these small office fires brought this building down after burning about 4 hours, and a lot of smoke, which is curious enough on its own, down to the ground in about 7 seconds, the total collapse. Makes no sense. But let's take a look at the FEMA report. Now, FEMA came out in 2002 with their report, assisted by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Before the NIST report came out, what did they say? The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Wait, you spent $600,000 on this report, and you don't know how the building came down? Our best hypothesis, fire plus random damage, has only a low probability of occurrence. Wait a minute. What do you do when your best hypothesis has a low probability of occurrence? Maybe we should come up with a new hypothesis that has a higher probability of occurrence. No. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, though, for those hoping to resolve the issue, all of the steel, except for 2 pieces, which you're going to hear about tomorrow, was sent to China for recycling. Before the report came out saying, hey, we don't know how the building came out, maybe we should look at the steel. Fascinating. Who sent the steel to China? FEMA was involved. The mayor's office was involved. Prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cite crucial evidence that can answer many questions, is on the slow boat to China. showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. This is the magazine that fire protection engineers communicate with throughout the United States. And what does Jonathan Barnett, who did join the FEMA team, say about a typical investigation?
When you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
Oh, that's a shame. Why was that? Because you shipped all the steel away. What's the kind of scientific method that FEMA is using here? If the evidence contradicts the fire hypothesis, destroy it. This is not science. What do the experts say? Here's an expert without an axe to grind. He's in Europe. In fact, the top European controlled demolition expert, Danny Jawenko, he said that it starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. Now, he said this before the person who was showing him on the laptop told him that this happened on 9/11. He's looking at it blindly. What is this? It's a controlled demolition, he says. A team of experts did this. Professional work, without a doubt. Then they say, well, hey, this happened on 9/11. What? Shekevere? He says. Did I say that right? And he says, well, they must have worked very fast then. You know, and he still, until his untimely death recently in a car accident, he maintained that, yeah, it's a controlled demolition. As do over 60 structural engineers signed on to Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, including Kamal Obeid, who says, a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and pattern loss of several columns at key locations within the building. Is that something fire can accomplish? Let's take a look and see if anybody knew about this building's collapse before it happened. Like, for instance, these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, caught on CNN camera, hearing an explosion behind them, looking back over their shoulder, and saying this into the camera. Did they have foreknowledge, or do they just assume that the fires in that building are about to blow up the building? And what about Kevin McPadden, who, before he talked about those explosions, he's talking about what he heard on a radio held by a Red Cross worker at about several blocks away, where they moved everybody back because they were concerned about this building, because they said it had some structural issues, and that's why they weren't fighting the fire, according to the word there. But here's what he hears, Kevin McPadden hears.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? These things need to be researched, examined under oath, and people need to be brought into a real investigation. Like Jane Stanley, for instance, of the BBC, who announced the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it happened. They apologize for this grievous error, and they cite the confusing issues, the events of the day. Does this make them psychic? What is going on here? Is there some sort of script that's being read? These are questions that have to be answered. But CNN did much better. They announced it early in the morning. Let's listen.
In New York, Alan Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
And just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. It's mistakenly in on Plain Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It's like a fire.
There was no other 50-story building that went down. In fact, there was no other building that went down other than the 3 skyscrapers. So 15 minutes after the second tower collapsed, we have an announcement that the 50-story building collapsed too, raising the ominous question, was it supposed to collapse at that time? Was it a dud that didn't go off? And is that why there's so much other foreknowledge supporting it? Is that why construction workers are walking out or away from the building? What are construction workers doing down there anyway? Those of us who have looked at this for a while see this as direct evidence, all these features, and fire can't count for any one of these, let alone all 8 of them. With additional supporting documentation that we went through, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition for World Trade Center 7. Now that's a problem for us. Why? Because Building 7 is a part of the overall 9/11 conspiracy, no matter how you define such a conspiracy. If we're being lied to about the cause of the destruction of this building, obviously it in and of itself requires an investigation, but because of its intimate association with the events of that day, it draws into question the other towers as well and their destruction. So at 8E911 Truth, inspired by the wonderful Barbara Honegger, we erected a 3rd beam into the New York City skyline last year on the eve of 9/11 to commemorate the importance of the smoking gun of 9/11, the obvious controlled demolition, because we believe that provides the key to justice for the victims lost in the Twin Towers. And so we've adopted the 3-beam icon now as our, along with our logo, if you will. We find it striking and powerful and meaningful because the Twin Towers, after we look at Building 7 and gain the respect of people who didn't know about it, much less its controlled demolition, they're much more open to looking at the evidence with the World Trade Center Twin Towers, which is actually even more clearly a controlled demolition, albeit a very different one than we've seen. Let's start with the structure. An amazing structure, unique for its time, an innovative structure that won awards from the American Society of Civil Engineers and won praise from NIST itself in its report. The structure held up to the airplanes, did its job. It's just that those darn airplanes scraped all the fireproofing off, making those trusses vulnerable. We'll take a look at that more tomorrow. But this building had 47 massive core columns. At the base, almost solid steel, 52 inches by 22 inches, thinning to 2 inches at the mid-height, and to the lightest part of the structure, up at the top, as little as 3/8 of an inch thick, those steel members. So, and when you see the building coming down in the videos, realize what we're talking about here. There's more steel on the facade of this building with these 14-inch square tube columns every 3 feet 9 inches marching across this building than there is windows. That collapse had to come down through this steel, or did it? Did the steel have to be removed to make way and cause for the collapse? We'll get to that, but there's 100,000 tons of steel in each of these towers. An incredible heat sink, again, drawing the heat away from the source of such as a fire, which is the reason steel frame skyscrapers have never collapsed. because even those fires have sometimes lasted longer than the fireproofing is designed to protect it. And so here's the official theory we have, and we'll get into more of this tomorrow, but the trusses sag as a result of the fires. That might happen, but they claim that there's an inward force, therefore, because they're pulling in the columns, because some of the photographs reveal that the columns bowed inward in the seconds prior to the collapse. So this is the column failure theory because of this. And then the top portion drives the rest of the building down because of its massive weight. The structure underneath couldn't handle that weight. That's basically the official story. Interesting to note, in order to make their computer fail, like they believe they saw in the videos, they had to apply a 5,000-pound load on every column after removing this connection. And this is completely ludicrous, because there would be no additional load, or very little, from the sagging trusses pulling in these columns. And yet they saw them pulled in the video, so they just did what they needed to do to make it work. How could those columns have been pulled in? Well, if the core columns were compromised, and tomorrow you'll look at some opportunities for such, it might have pulled this truss down with them, which would have indeed provided a lateral load on these columns, causing them to fail. So let's take a look at the Twin Towers and see if there's any evidence of controlled demolition according to our template, our criteria here, starting with, is there a sudden onset of destruction, not at the base of the structure like we saw in World Trade Center 7, but a very different type of deceptive controlled demolition in this case. Fires doing damage because of the airplane impacts. They would want us to believe that the buildings came down due to the weakening, the structural weakening by fires. So do we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions and see flashes of light? You'll hear more of these tomorrow from Graham, who has done some extraordinary research on this subject. Listen to a couple of these first responders, though.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed inside the lobby.
Is that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the...
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
Just when the bomb went bomb and another explosion. Why?
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. Continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion and then with a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion from the device that planted before, or get planted and got exploded later. Then there was secondary explosions and then subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now that's the first time we're hearing that. So two planes and explosives that were in the building, is that correct?
That is a working theory at this point. That
It sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, three big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We heard a very loud blast explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, the building was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion. There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden, you hear an explosion, and you can see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower rather than has collapsed, and we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble. This is about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions, 3 thuds.
All my fluids that are popping out.
Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched. A few of them exploded. And it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
Surely some of these witnesses made it into the official reports. Not one. No reports of explosions. This is quite disturbing to the architects and engineers that I represent. Let's take a look and see what they might be referring to. Controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways, as I mentioned. How about belts of explosions like the first responders described, as you'll hear tomorrow? Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Just in looking at the video alone, let alone all the other evidence that witnesses will be testifying to, not witnesses, experts today. Here's the South Tower. Any similarity here to a known controlled demolition on the left? One more time. Bands of explosions starting not necessarily at the bottom, anywhere they want them to start. This is the North Tower developing its collapse. On the lower left, you can see the full plume of the outward arching streamers, the pyroclastic-like clouds, a geometry of fireworks. Compare that to known explosions. Is there any similarity? And of course, this is after the first 4 seconds. You just saw the first 4 seconds. So something's going on in that first 4 seconds that's different. Let's take a look. Here's the North Tower. We're told this upper block drove the rest of the building down. The planes hit here. There's no movement down from here until about now. Once again, this upper block is destroying itself in what can only be described as a miniature controlled demolition, if you will, of the top 15 stories. There's nothing left to drive the rest of the building down at any speed. Let's look at the structure. The upper portion is the lightest. The lower portion is the heaviest. Let's compare. If you look at Newton's third law of motion, there's an equal and opposite reaction against a lighter object striking a heavier object. Hey, it's the same if you drop the lighter object onto the heavier object. Equal and opposite destructive force. Which one will give up the ghost first? Obviously, we're drawing a comparison here. And Mr. Chandler will discuss this more with you tomorrow. But take a start look now. Stop bands of explosions wrapping all the way around the building, like the first responders described. That upper portion is destroyed first. Let's take a look from below. A lot of violent activity with squibs, isolated explosive ejections occurring underneath. In a moment, we'll talk about the lateral ejection of this material. But take a close look now at the corner, where you see developing a series of explosions rapidly advancing down the corner of the building much faster than the rest of these explosions, almost as fast as the free-falling objects. And you'll see tomorrow how fast this building is coming down. How could somebody get into this building, or some group of people? Well, if one had access to the core, to the elevator shafts in the building, they would have access to the core columns and beams that occur in the building, and it would be relatively discreet. But if you had an elevator modernization going on, which we did the 9 months prior to 9/11, the largest one in the world, in fact, that might give some sort of undercover operation. So this is a source of investigation. Ace Elevator had this contract. They had 85 employees in the building at the time of the first plane impact, and they fled. And these are experts that usually help the first responders rescue the victims. It was quite a scandal, actually, documented in USA Today. So wireless detonation is common in the last decade or two. There's no need to run miles of wire and so forth. We have a complete geometry of symmetry here, equally distributed debris. In fact, up to 1,400 foot diameter, landing up to 600 feet away. This is a nice, neat pile of a classic implosion, World Trade Center 7, versus the extremely explosive event known as the Twin Towers. Do we have isolated ejections occurring in the building? Well, how about here, here, here? What are these? This tells us that these are puffs of air being produced by that giant piston. Well, we already saw that giant piston was destroyed. Any air pressure would be released upward, most likely. Also, these are occurring up to 60 stories down below this destruction. And we would expect in 60 feet of open office planning, say the elevator shaft is down at the other end, that air is going to be pushed by this non-existent piston into this room. It'll equalize that pressure fairly uniformly before it exits. And if it does, it'll blow out all the windows, or none of them, or most of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, geometrically precise, violent ejections of pulverized building materials, not air. Do we have a near free fall pace through the path of greatest resistance? Stay tuned to tomorrow. And do we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure? Sure looks like it. Almost all the way down to the ground. Individual elements completely destroyed. Let's look at the South Tower. It's hit 30 stories down. It does begin to tip over a little bit, but then it's completely destroyed, almost disintegrated in this cloud. It doesn't end up in some mass on the ground below. So we have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes and the fires, and asymmetrical loading from this portion of the building, which is continuing its angular momentum, theoretically, falling 22 degrees off the building. And yet, watch what happens below. Complete symmetrical destruction all the way down to the ground. Just like the first responders described. Pop, pop, pop. Bands of explosions. And this guy turned and ran, or we might have seen it come all the way. He should have stayed here. Complete, total destruction, save from shards of perimeter wall units. Ejecting lateral steel pieces, heavy structural steel pieces, free flying through the air. Not banana peeling like some suggest off of the building. No, they're achieving those lateral distances due to their initial velocity out of the side of the building, which you'll discover in tomorrow's presentation by Mr. Chandler, how enormous that force must have been, traveling up to instant acceleration with speeds 55 miles an hour or more. And we have floors that we're looking for. Now, this is a pancaking collapse. We see pancakes at the bottom. We have 110 floors in each of these skyscrapers. They're all an acre in size. We're looking for 110 floors stacked up in some mess at the bottom. How many do we see? 50? 20? 10? We don't see one. We see a two-story pile of perimeter columns and core columns. Where are the floors? Where's the concrete? I mean, we're talking 90,000 tons of concrete is missing at the base of that building. Here it is, small particles, 100 microns in size, like talcum powder, this concrete was. And tomorrow, you're going to find out what was in that concrete dust besides concrete and gypsum that should not have been there. But this dust is composed of up to 30% concrete. It's rather extraordinary.
110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone or a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. Building collapsed.
Oops, the building collapsed to dust, he says.
You have two. And you see, there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is a lump of steel. The concrete was full surface. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you're on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just the site, river to river, it was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
Everyone was basically in shock about what they were seeing down there, particularly this firefighter.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there were 10,000 file cabinets or so, steel file cabinets in this building, but this is the only one that they could find. Where do you think 10,000 steel file cabinets went? I found steel filings in the dust samples that came up to the magnet in the samples that were given to me by Jeanette McKinley, who lived across the street from the South Tower and collected this dust. You could pick this file cabinet up in your pinky. How did it survive? Oh, it was in the basement. Interesting. Why do we have 700 bone fragments the size of a grain of rice found on top of that skyscraper? Can that be explained by a gravitational-induced pancaking collapse where we would expect bodies to be trapped between floors, not pulverized to this incredible degree? The plane that hit the South Tower came over the Deutsche Bank building where the bone fragments are found and sent its ejections out the other side. So they're not from the people in the airplane. Is that me? That's terrible. Turn off your cell phones, please. We believe this is evidence, direct evidence of explosive destruction. We'll get to number 9 and 10 again tomorrow with Kevin Ryan's and John Cole's testimony. Fire can't account for any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. With additional corroborating evidence that we've seen, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition. The truth about 9/11 appears to be much darker than we have possibly imagined. We've seen that explosives were used to destroy these 3 skyscrapers. And of course, it takes months of advanced planning and engineering to place such explosives. Who had the means, the opportunity, the motive to engage in this crime? Who benefited? These are the classic questions that crime investigators and journalists should be asking, but are not. And that's the purpose of the Toronto hearings this week. Who had access to these highly secure buildings? Who had access to these extremely sophisticated explosives that you're going to learn about tomorrow from Dr. Niels Herrick? The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth don't speculate about these issues. We don't have conspiracy theories. In fact, the laws of physics are incapable of caring about conspiracy theories. The evidence we've seen tonight is just a small fraction of the vast body of information that the 9/11 Truth Movement has put together for you. The questions raised are numerous, and ominous and have yet to be answered. It's the hope of the 1,500 architects and engineers that I represent that these hearings prove quite successful toward getting all of us a new investigation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Richard. We will now move on to questions from our panel. Yes, Professor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Gage. Remarkable presentation and very persuasive. The modeling that NIST did on the World Trade Center 7 building, those models have not been released, as I understand it. Is there any possible way that we can obtain those models and test them? They should be in the public domain because we need to learn about how high-rise steel buildings come down with fire.
Indeed. No, they won't be released into the public domain because it might jeopardize public safety if they were. That is the reason that given to us from NIST that they will not release them. And of course, there are other reasons that must be in effect for their non-release. But we continue to try. There are several in this room who have indeed written FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, and have been denied for this information. There is no explicable reason for the denial of this information. And the reason we don't have the structural drawings either of either of these 3 skyscrapers, and those are being held also from the public for no reason that is justifiable.
Professor Lee and then Professor Jenkins.
Also, thank you for an excellent presentation. And I have a couple of quick technical questions, and then perhaps in round 2 I can come back to something deeper. Is there any significance to the very different look of the controlled demolition of the Towers 1 and 2 and Tower 7? Towers 1 and 2 had these gigantic pyroclastic clouds, and Tower 7 was more classically in the textbook because it just went down without enormous lateral movement.
Yes, well, we have visual evidence that there's extreme explosive forces at play in the Twin Towers, hurling without regard to public safety or the care of the surrounding buildings, many of which were quite destroyed. And the question is, why did they do it that way? It didn't look like a pancaking collapse. Couldn't they have made it look like a pancaking collapse like World Trade Center 7? We might have believed it more had that been the case. My speculation, and it's just that, is that they didn't have access to the perimeter columns as much, perhaps. So they had to have enough explosive force to take out not only the core columns, but the floors and everything else in the building. And by default, that pressure sent these free-flying objects in such speed and distance. This is a great question to ask Mr. Chandler tomorrow, of course.
Okay. Another quick one, and this may also be raised tomorrow as well. The eyewitnesses, and now you've assembled quite a few of them, describe 2 different kinds of prior explosions prior to the collapse of the building. Boom, 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 and boom. And so, and from what you have been learning about the way these demolitions operate, is there what would be the explanation for the 2 different kinds of explosions? If that is, an interesting question.
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand it before I open my mouth again, too. The different types of explosions in World Trade Center 7 versus the Twin Towers. Let's go back to 7. Normally, we use, not we, the controlled demolition industry uses high energy explosives, which have very loud bangs, very bright flashes. In the case of Building 7, a deceptive controlled demolition, they don't want those signatures because it would be obvious. And so we have a good reason to use something else, like thermite, which we're going to be hearing about tomorrow. It's quieter. It's actually more effective in recently patented cutter charges in the last dozen years or so. Does that help, or did I get off on the wrong track?
I'm sort of following up a line of inquiry that may or may not lead to anything, so let's just leave it at that.
Okay. Sorry if I missed it.
Professor Jenkins.
Thank you. I've been trying to get some sense of the magnitude of this effort to a job required to set these buildings up for this kind of controlled demolition. And one aspect of that that's relevant here is the question of whether to get the kind of collapse which we saw, would you have to have charges on perimeter columns in the towers? To get a symmetrical collapse with very few remains of the perimeter columns, would it be necessary to cut many of those columns as well?
I believe so. The question is, did they have access? Is there evidence of that? I think you'll find tomorrow that Mr. Chandler has documented evidence of that. But maybe also it would be enough to have that explosive force from the inside. The core column area, if that explosive force was enough to push out and break the bolts that connected those individually welded subunits of perimeter columns together, 3 columns and 3 spandrel panels. So that's a great question, and there's some indication due to the bolt patterns and the ends of those perimeter columns not being sheared off. There's a lot of bolts missing. There's holes that are not warped in the 4 bolt holes that connect those 2 together. Some have theorized that somebody got into the building well beforehand, removed many of the bolts. So that's another possibility that would weaken the lateral resistance capability of those and make them more vulnerable to flying out individually due to explosive forces.
I suppose the question is whether you could get the symmetry that we see from an explosion that had its source in the center.
Yeah.
It would have to cut the perimeter rather simultaneously and evenly in order to get that.
Ideally, and you know what, that's possible that might have even happened. I don't see enough localized explosives in each of the perimeter columns 3 feet 9 inches on center. What I'm seeing is more of a general explosive. Now you'll see hopefully tomorrow some of these very isolated explosives on the corner columns that Mr. Chandler will hopefully enlighten us with. But as far as the individual columns, I don't see them being cut. Maybe I'm not seeing it. Oh, and you see, down at the ground, these columns are laying everywhere, these perimeter wall units. We don't see evidence of those perimeter wall units being cut, not much evidence. We see that lots of the ends of them individually, and they're fairly clean with 4 bolt holes in them. So that also leads me to believe that they didn't systematically cut the perimeter columns.
I have one more question, one you may not want to entertain. You have argued that the very clear evidence of demolition of World Trade 7 has strong implications about how the towers came down. And I agree with that in general, but there is a puzzling point here. The overall global motivation, we are told, for this bringing these towers down is to enhance a Pearl Harbor effect. I don't see how the destruction of World Trade 7 could be accomplished with that global motivation. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that the same terrorists couldn't have more than one motivation. But nevertheless, I think it is clear, I think other people would agree, the towers have already come down. There has been a horrific loss of life. What is added to the Pearl Harbor effect by bringing down Building 7? In fact, if you were trying to get a Pearl Harbor effect enhancement from 7, you would publicize it. But in fact, it hasn't been publicized, as you pointed out repeatedly. If anything, the information about Building 7 has been suppressed. So I'm left with a puzzle about the motivation for the destruction of Building 7, and the fact that I cannot see it being continuous with the motivation for the destruction of the towers leads me to think that there's something here that might suggest different actors involved in the two kinds of destruction.
Interesting speculation. I really appreciate that. What is evident is that they didn't want us to know about it. It appears that it was supposed to go down under the cover of the massive dust cloud created and smoke cloud created by the Twin Towers destruction 15 minutes earlier that morning. And since it didn't go down at that time, they had a huge problem on their hands. That's my speculation. And they solved that problem by sending those workers in there, fixing the problem with the dud, and moving everybody back and telling everybody there was structural damage, when in fact there's no indication of much structural damage, particularly from the debris. And so I think they did the best they could with a very nasty situation and just kept the media out of it altogether as best they could. There were certainly economic imperatives from the owner of the building, but Larry Silverstein purchased in a 99-year lease the entire complex, having already owned Building 7. So it's very possible that he wanted a complete site to rebuild from. That's just speculation, though.
But I just have one final, very quick question. If I can remember. Is it very clear to you that you would have had to have extensive foreknowledge, extensive in time, in order to set up Building 7 for demolition? It could not have been done on 9/11.
This is correct. It would take months and dozens of operatives.
Judge Imposimato, and then Professor Lee again.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Without explosion, do you think that the three towers buildings would have collapsed the same? The first dome, the same.
If there were no explosions, would the jet plane impacts and fires have created a collapse that might have looked like what we believe is an explosive demolition, a unique one?
And the second...
Wait, can I answer that one first? Because I'm rapidly aging as well. So, as well as our previous speaker acknowledged as well, I mean, not you. So, you're asking an architect to speculate how a high-rise structure might have collapsed when one has never done that, first of all. There's no precedent for a fire collapsing a building. But there's a high-rise steel frame or concrete frame building. But there's plenty of precedents for buildings that do collapse due to fire, aside from jet plane impacts. They fall over to the path of least resistance. They don't fall straight down through the structural strength. It's like cutting a tree. If you cut a tree, is there any chance it can go straight down to its strength? No, and turn to sawdust too on the way down. Not going to happen. But
say there was the most massive fire that was 3,000 degrees, and you'll learn about how hot these fires were tomorrow versus how hot they needed to be to produce the evidence that you're going to be hearing about tomorrow. It's possible that a steel frame skyscraper could collapse under extraordinary, like blast furnace conditions, and it might have fallen over, would have fallen over. Okay, I'm ready.
Anyway, do you think that the explosion has been the main cause of collapse or the secondary cause of collapse?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Main cause or secondary cause?
Secondary what?
Explosion.
Were the explosions the main cause of the collapse or a secondary cause?
Yes.
My belief is that they were the main cause. This building could not have started a collapse under the conditions, even with jet plane impacts separating several columns. NIST said the building did its job. It stood, and they said it succumbed to fire. You'll hear about the temperatures associated with those fires as well tomorrow. They could not, at 250 degrees centigrade, have compromised this steel.
Okay, the first question is, your scientific expertise has been confirmed by many witnesses. It is possible to get the witnesses transcript and the transcription of the witness that you will show the house.
You would like to see the transcripts of this, of the video clips that I played you. Yes, we can get those for you. The original transcripts, I don't even know where those are. That would be a great question for Graham McQueen, who will be speaking about 150 witnesses of explosions who were very well documented tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Professor Lee.
Yes, I'd like to follow up on Herb Jenkins' interesting, provocative question about Building 7 and what purpose was served. Was the Pearl Harbor agenda furthered by the destruction? And I have formed the following thought, which I'll throw out to you now and to the steering committee in general. We need to combine the skills that Paul Zaremka brought to us this morning on studying corporate activities and bring that to bear on the tenets of Building 7, including the Security and Exchange Commission, the Secret Service, the CIA, and who knows who else. So, and of course, the excellent skill set that Richard Gage and his colleagues brings to this work is not the skill set that we need to sort of dig into how many cases that were about to be prosecuted were abandoned because the Building 7 was destroyed. Absolutely. So I'd just like to throw that out. You or anyone else wants to comment.
I have no comment on that. Does anyone?
Over 1,000 cases were destroyed.
So that seems to me one thing we can think about is a task force that starts on that line of inquiry.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Yes, Professor Johnson.
I'd like to go back to the topic of explosions. Clearly, the top of the building was demolished, the buildings were demolished, the Twin Towers, by massive explosions. Have there been any attempts to calculate the quantity of explosives, perhaps in tons of TNT, the equivalent, to make those buildings, the tops of those buildings, disintegrate the way they did? And have we had any independent reviews by explosive experts affirming that these explosives are available generally, or from what source they might have come? This is a very unusual event, and these explosions are very massive.
Yes, the second question I'd like to leave for our expert testimony tomorrow to people who have a lot more insight into these matters, Kevin Ryan particularly, and Niels Harrod, and John Cole, and David Chandler. The first question already went through. So could you send it again? I told you, I warned you, and I proved to you that I'm aging.
Have there been any estimates of the quantity, of the size, the mass?
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, what you're going to learn tomorrow is that there is actual physical residues of the explosives and or incendiaries, as we'll learn about them tomorrow. There's a quantity that can be established based on the sampling that was found. And we'll learn about that tomorrow from Professor Herrick. As far as explosives experts that would say how many tons of TNT equivalent it would take, I think Professor Herrick might be able to answer that one. I'm setting him up already. I haven't heard such a number, but I have heard that in terms of the explosive, the nanothermite explosives that we're going to be hearing about tomorrow, there must have been at least 2, 3, or 4 dozen tons of this material brought in through the eyes of security, unless they were sleeping when this happened. And so we certainly want an investigation of the security company, who was that, Stratosec or Securicom, who had the contract for security in the whole complex until 9/11, until that date. That was the date that ended their contract, or the day before.
May I follow up with another question? The explosions occurred, it appears, just above where the airplanes hit. Is there any possibility that the explosives were brought in by the airplanes?
Sure, there's a possibility. You're not allowed to bring explosives on airliners, though. So if Homeland Security was in charge of those airplanes, I can't imagine them allowing that. But let's say that they did, and the planes hit and explosives went off, and there was a big explosion at that time. That would not explain the rapid series of explosions all the way down the building, wrapping around the building like a belt, like the first responders described. It wouldn't explain the free-flying objects that are responding to an equivalent set of forces traveling down the building, pushing them out. It might explain some of the other phenomena, but it's certainly not enough to do the job. The key is the equidistant explosive source. After all, there are 10,000 file cabinets missing or so in this building. 110 floors are missing or so. And so if a localized extreme force at the top is not going to account for complete destruction of this building down to the ground.
Are there further questions from the panelists? No. We will bring this session to a close then, and thank you very much, Richard Gage. We will now take a break for 15 minutes. You have
Yeah, no, not everything, because said anybody took a nap or anything. But in the other meeting, you have to do some other
beautiful province. I'm Finnish background. I lived 4 years of my life in Finland and did my military service as well. Yeah, well, it was a good country to do it for because we weren't involved. We weren't fighting in Afghanistan. I'm not a peace activist actually, but I do appreciate the sacrifices that Eastern Europeans made to try to maintain their independence from the Soviet Union or from the Nazi threat. You know, and unfortunately, all the wars now, they all seem to have corporate interests as their primary motive to destroy economies and security. Libya, as well as Afghanistan and Iraq, and the overt wars in Pakistan and Yemen and Sudan. It's a tragedy. No voice in the West. You're the best. I believe that this 9/11 is basically was a springboard. It didn't get into our society. It promoted the shock doctrine. That's disaster capitalism. All over the world to wipe out the middle class, regionalize the lower class, century,
It's always been my analysis. Emergency the last 3 years,
see tomorrow, very it's like in the November 9/11 is when it came out. We know it wasn't the day of 9/11. It takes months. So we know that 550 my broken English is very I'm enjoying it thoroughly.
And I was knocked out by your presentation. I've seen different things on the web, sort of, here and there, but some morning thing about all at once. It's keep thinking of so many people that are like brought in with me today to see it.
What are the tracks?
Yeah.
I got one right here. I mean, it's for sale. 4 hours. You got $20.
Well,
you don't have to buy it now. You can buy it on the website.
I probably will wait. Yeah.
That's like this.
I did have something that kind of caught my ear because one of my sort of, it's sort of a speculation thing. One of my gut feelings about why the building 7 something to go down at 5 o'clock was what you said, which is that it seemed to me like it was meant to go down at like 10:30, and it could have been easily explained by, well, it just took debris and the cloud and it all happened at once. But it's just, you feel that, is there any kind of thing that takes that above speculation, that it could have, anything that makes you think that it could have been planned to go with earlier?
Yeah, I think it's going to get bigger Saturday or
Why were they telling us it was going to blow up? They must have known. And it's also a little charges are planned months in advance. So they didn't just go plant those charges that day. They would fix them. Rationally, how can you come to any other conclusion? Given that its destruction was announced at 11:07, the fireman ran by saying a 50-story building went down.
I heard that story. I knew about the CNN and or the BBC at 5 o'clock. I have not heard that. So he was a fireman who told the reporter. Yeah,
he didn't name it.
Yeah, sorry.
Am I interrupting?
No, go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Gage.
Hi, Wendy.
Yeah, I know. I bought it off Wendy. She's a volunteer. She didn't realize that she didn't have to pay for it, so I bought her admission for 4 days. Anyway, that was the last ticket of it. I just want to say thank you very much for the work you've done. Amazing, great amount of work you do. I'm a hardcore novelist prisoner. I know I don't the abuse I take, even straining it up. Close to it. I just got back from a motorcycle rally in Finger Lakes, New York. I go in the tropical states a lot, and I can't help it. I have to look at my head. Have you looked into it? Have you looked into it?
Uncontrollable urge.
It is. I can't help it. Anyway, the question is this. Do you have any thoughts on this?
We have a whole
negative, positive?
We have a 4-page paper talking about the towers under the DEW theory. First of all, what she does, for whatever reason, she denies all the evidence you're going to see tomorrow about extreme temperatures.
I don't understand that either.
Understand what?
Why she does that. I don't understand why she dismisses.
Well, her theory,
anyway, I'm sorry.
What she says is that her theory that doesn't hate steam.
Yes, I have it.
Okay. I just
only begun to read it, but yes.
There's a lot of very interesting questions here.
Well, yes. There are things that I was going to actually just mention.
I'm nervous because my bag is missing and I don't know where it is.
See explanations for it. Elsewhere.
Hold on to that.
And one could be, one of them being molten metal that stays molten under buildings.
Yes.
And also being the cars that melted.
That's just what I was going to
so
because back and I get another opportunity, then I'm going to car started to explode inside the parking lot. The car started cooking.
Paper didn't burn.
Paper didn't burn.
Trees didn't burn. But the tires of the cars melted. And all the door handles melted.
Yeah, some plastic, some didn't melt, some did.
Have you seen the fire truck where the whole front of it is like this one?
I can't
The whole front of it just melts right now.
Yeah, that's the guys that were sitting over here. They probably do.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
We were talking about this. There are a couple of things that I'm curious about that don't have to come up in your thing. One is the melted cars that toaster cars that, like, from some distance away, where the tires were melted, the like parts of the cars burned.
I don't know the answer to that.
I'm trying to think what cause that. It seems like
no, and I don't care to speculate. Obviously, there's something strange going on. I just don't know what it is. What we don't have evidence for is directed energy weapons at that magnitude that can destroy these precious energy sources astronomical. Second of all, her theory, by her own words, depend on cooling temperatures. She denies the molten metal ions, the nanothermite, even in the dust, which is peer reviewed. The molten metal sitting by British all of that is denied. Explosions are denied.
isolated explosive objections. So why should I give any credence to a theory which denies all the evidence that is scientific? So, and then on top of that, the theory she uses to explain the evidence, such as the spire, which is just been shaken from the dust of
good question. That's something that it's hard to figure out what accounts for that. I mean, thermite keeps molten metal 2 or 3 months after the event because they recorded them. I mean, they were running for 5 months. They didn't put the fires out until December. But they stayed. There was molten metal flowing underneath the rubble for quite a long time. Would thermite keep something like that burning that long?
It's not the issue, though, how long it burns. What's the issue is how hot it is. And it's only 2,000 degrees.
Yeah, sure. But it makes you wonder how it got there. Like, you know, does it not give a clue, or does the fact that it lasted does not give us a clue as to something that like how the buildings were evolved?
I don't know how long molten metal is supposed to be. Somebody is going to have to what? No. Okay. There's a whole lot. Did you remove my bag?
Yeah, there's other holes here. Yes. There's no sort of, no corresponding
there's no explanation at all. That makes any sense. Absolutely.
I'm saying it's not just one or two people. She's just missing. She's just missing a lot. Lined up on this restaurant. That's more than 600. That's like a mile. Okay, so that's yeah, it's still too long. Why would you?
Just write down, why don't you write down what you wrote down what you want me to say? What you want me to say? Okay, I just need at least one other person to okay it. This lady would like to make us to make a short announcement that anyone who would like to meet to try and work on outreach and activism things should meet. And how can they meet? And what do you propose? That they meet after the conference in the lobby, or do you want to give them here briefly so we can talk about when we can't stay in here? We have to be out of this room by 6, right? No, like everything has to be out by 6. So we're trying to end at 5:45, which is going to be tough. Do you want them to meet? Do you want them to meet there, or do you want to sitting areas? Okay, so we could even say like today and tomorrow, the next couple of days, anybody that would like to collaborate on outreach initiatives that they meet afterwards out in the lobby at the end of the day.
No, but I didn't put it all together. For a long time. Somebody told me about it, and I said, I'm embarrassed to say I didn't even know. I have it too. It's great.
Including endurance.
Somebody just to have a look at it. It's so started to. You asked me every time.
We need people to start taking their seats again. Thank you. Appreciate your cooperation, your swift cooperation.
Could you take that glass away?
This one or Rachel.
Have they?
What time do you feel them to have? What is the correct time?
3:40.
3:40? Okay, can you make another announcement? Now, how about online?
Please continue taking your seats. Thank you, audience.
Yeah, it'll be a little bit less than No. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure this out right now. You said it's 40. Let's see. Looks like we're still happier. I had you starting at 3:30, so I'm just going to see if I can add 3:40, 4, and then if I had 60, 5:55, 4:55, 55, 35, and then we'll have 10 minutes for questions. So what I have... So from 3:40 to 4:55, that would give 45 minutes for presentation and 19 minutes to speak. 55.
Well, there's a lot of
have you sit right here and that's
maybe that's a bit better.
what would you prefer?
No, if you put me a limit of 40 minutes, I don't have a...
Okay, folks, please do gather your thoughts and your sounds.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Doors closing. These hearings are back in session. A couple of announcements. 3 announcements. We expect every bit of full attendance for the next 2 days of these hearings. For that matter, please wear your badges tomorrow. In fact, I would say you must wear your badges tomorrow to get into the room. Secondly, on the final day of these hearings, September 11th, on Sunday, there will be an hour at the end of the day when the panel will address the proceedings directly. Another announcement, those wishing to gather for discussing strategies for bringing attention to this important evidence which has been vetted in these hearings each day should meet at the end of the day at the sitting area in this building's lobby. Finally, beg pardon. We have requested of our media people to inform us about online viewing. A tally was taken that 550 people viewed Barbara and Richard all at once, as it were. They viewed continuously during that period. Today is Thursday, middle of the day. We are Friday. Some people could sneak out, perhaps. Almost 2,000 unique views were tallied during some part of this afternoon. It is my pleasure next to introduce Michel Kossadowski. Professor Michel Kossadowski is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Ottawa. He is Director of the Center for Research on Globalization. He has acted as an economic advisor to governments of developing countries and has worked as a consultant for international organizations, including the United Nations Development Program, United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the World Health Organization. He is the author of 7 wide-ranging books on development economics, and he is perhaps best known for his subsequent excoriating analyses of the structural violence of neoliberalism and the turn of that violence towards open warfare in his books, The Globalization of Poverty, War and Globalization, subtitled The Truth Behind 9/11, and finally book titled America's War on Terrorism, parenthetically identified War on Terrorism. These influential analyses of the geopolitical context of the events of 9/11 have been followed by 2 more recent books, titled one, The Global Economic Crisis, co-edited with Andrew Marshall, and also Towards a World War III Scenario. In his testimony today, Professor Kossadowski will address the subject of the global context and effects of 9/11. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michel Kossadowski.
No, it's true. But yeah, that's correct. Thank you. Yeah.
1 in 100.
1 in 100. No, I just said he
Microphone.
Yeah. Just said that he pronounced my name using the Russian phonetics rather than the Anglo-Saxon phonetics, but I'm very gratified by that because it doesn't happen very often. You'll excuse us because we've just arrived from Montreal together with Cynthia McKinney and Marlena Zabroya, and we just had about 5 minutes to rush to the event. Can I move this? Yeah. That's all right. Yeah. What I'd like to address in my presentation are the broad consequences of 9/11 with regard to US military doctrine, but more broadly, the pretext and justification which the lies surrounding 9/11 have given to waging a war of conquest under the banner of what we call the war on terrorism, or the global war on terrorism, which we could call the GWOT. Now, the GWOT was launched. I thought this was going to be a serious presentation, obviously. The global war on terrorism was launched late at night by the War Cabinet, which was formed in the afternoon of 9/11, and a decision was taken to declare war on Afghanistan as a state sponsor of the 9/11 attacks. In other words, a sovereign country somewhere in Central Asia, on the grounds that Al-Qaeda and mastermind Osama bin Laden was behind these attacks, and consequently Afghanistan as hosting Al-Qaeda was responsible for a military attack on the United States of America. And what is more important is that the following morning, without any evidence, nobody knew who had done it at, on the same day. But the following morning, Eastern European time in Brussels, the Atlantic Alliance met and invoked Article 5 of the Treaty of Washington, which essentially states that an attack on one of its members constitutes an attack on all of its members under the concept of collective defense. Now, immediately we see unfolding this notion of preemptive war, that this was an act of defense. This was a decision on the part of NATO to defend itself against the attack of a foreign country, and as a result, NATO didn't actually declare war on the 12th. It waited until barely 2 or 3 days before, based on some State Department document which was composed and never verified, and then they said, yes, we now rubber stamp the decision that we took tentatively on September the 12th. But needless to say, this tragic event of 9/11 was used as a pretext and justification to wage war on an impoverished country in Central Asia. There were diplomatic exchanges between Afghanistan and the United States. People say the Taliban, but this was the government of Afghanistan, whether we like them or not. And they sent, I think, on 2 occasions, if there's evidence that bin Laden is behind these attacks, we'd be happy to hand him over to American justice. And George W. Bush said, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." That was his response. So that avenue was not taken. And anybody who has a minimal understanding of military planning will know that you don't plan a large-scale theater war in the matter of 4 weeks. This conference took several months to prepare. And imagine anybody who has looked at military documents knows that it takes several months and sometimes years to prepare a war of that size. So that the war on Afghanistan was in the pipeline well before 9/11. And 9/11 was the pretext and justification for waging this war using what former Central Command Commander General Tommy Franks calls a mass casualty producing event. It must be a military concept, a mass casualty producing event, which in the logic of Operation Northwoods, which was the secret plan to attack Cuba based on attacks in the Miami exile community with casualties. And that document envisaged precisely that. And then they said that the deaths of Cuban Americans would create a useful wave of indignation, which would then trigger a pretext and a justification to wage war on Cuba. That plan was never implemented. It was presented, it was under the Kennedy administration. It was presented by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You can look at it. It's a declassified document. Robert McNamara at the time was Secretary of Defense, and I think that the White House turned it down. But the concept is certainly on record. Now, what I'd like to address is the fact that this event of 9/11 initiated what we might call the Al-Qaeda legend, namely that Al-Qaeda and his leader Osama bin Laden constitute the outside enemy in the eyes of public opinion. And we saw that in the wake of these tragic events, immediately there was a mass mobilization of public opinion. And I don't think even sectors in Canada, I think everybody joined the bandwagon, virtually everybody, even trade unions, progressive organizations, and a few dissenting voices. My first reaction on the morning of 9/11, when George Tenet, head of the CIA, announced that Al-Qaeda and bin Laden was behind it, was twofold. One, of course, I was wondering how he could actually have done it from his hospital bed in Rawalpindi, because he was hospitalized, but we didn't know that at the time. So, but I then said to myself, but if Al-Qaeda is behind these attacks, who is behind Al-Qaeda? And I knew from the research I'd conducted on Yugoslavia in particular, but going back to the Soviet-Afghan War, that Al-Qaeda was an intelligence asset of the CIA, and this was amply recognized in numerous documents. And the response of the U.S. intelligence community was, yeah, we supported him, but he went against us, okay? You can read that. I'm quoting literally from press reports, from intelligence reports. It's when an intelligence asset goes against his sponsor. Now, we were the sponsors of Al-Qaeda. It was for a good cause. It was to fight the communists in the Soviet-Afghan War, and we sent in the Mujahideen. We trained them in these CIA camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We set up the religious schools, the madrasas. We then contracted with our friends in Saudi Arabia to send in Wahhabi missions into Afghanistan to train these people. This is fairly well documented, and I don't think we need to extend the discussion on that. But the understanding of the intelligence community is he turned against us. In the wake of the Cold War, the jihad then started to target the Western world, and that 9/11 was an attack by Muslim terrorists. Now, the blowback, I can tell you that the blowback is a fabrication. It is an absolute fabrication, and that's absolutely crucial to an understanding of how this event then led to shifts in US military doctrine, even in nuclear doctrine, okay? Even in the use of nuclear weapons, because they even say we might use a tactical nuclear weapon, a mini nuke, against bin Laden or against Saddam Hussein. I know, I read those documents inside out, and they actually say that. Now, when you look at a mini nuke, a B-6111, it's something of the order between 1/3 and 6 times a Hiroshima bomb, okay? So it's no small bomb. It's a bunker buster bomb, and that means you don't take out Osama bin Laden in his cave or in his hospital in Rawalpindi. Now, anybody who's been to Rawalpindi knows that it's a place which is swarming with US military advisors. So how did he get into his hospital on the 9th of September for kidney, for his kidney problem, and then when was he released from hospital? Either on the 10th or 11th, but his whereabouts were known. Donald Rumsfeld said, we don't know where he is. It's like looking for a needle in a stack of hay. Well, hello, yes, bin Laden's whereabouts have always been known. Why? Because Al-Qaeda is a CIA intelligence asset and has always been an intelligence asset and continues to be an intelligence asset. So there is no blowback. And I will argue that there's a blow forward. There's a blow forward. I will discuss that later, but when the blow forward has to do with the fact that the main ally of NATO in the war theater in Libya is Al-Qaeda. And there's absolutely no ambiguity with regard to that, because the CNN is actually acknowledging it. But they say they're not Al-Qaeda, they're former Al-Qaeda, and that now they're pro-democracy, okay? But we'll discuss that a bit later. Shortly before 9/11, I was involved in researching the civil war in Macedonia. And in fact, I was in touch with the Prime Minister's office frequently by telephone and email, because what was happening is that a US military mercenary company called MPRI, Military Professional Resources Incorporated, were advising both the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was integrated by Al-Qaeda units, Mujahideen, and they were also advising the Macedonian Defense Forces, and they were in fact coordinating the war on both sides. What happened now, just barely 2 months before 9/11, it hasn't been much publicized. The Mujahideen were caught red-handed with U.S. military advisors. These are all former commanders of the U.S. military. They're senior commanders. And they were caught red-handed together in the same unit or guerrilla unit. And this was this led to a political scandal in Macedonia. The Prime Minister made statements and so on, so that barely a few months before 9/11, I knew that the intelligence asset was still working for the CIA and was still being used in covert operations. But then I also knew, and that's important, that Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda affiliated organizations. Al-Qaeda is a very elusive concept. It includes quite a number of different organizations. But Al-Qaeda units were also being used in Bosnia in the early to mid-90s, integrating the Bosnian Muslim Army, and subsequently in the Kosovo Liberation Army, where Al-Qaeda was in fact involved, and they were also involved in training and so on, to the extent that they even people from different parts of the the Muslim world were buying real estate in Kosovo at the time. But what I want to signify by that is that that throughout that whole period, the enemy number one, which allegedly committed these attacks, was in close liaison with their intelligence sponsors, the CIA, but also Pakistan's inter-services intelligence, which really operated as a go-between. Pakistan ISI was in touch with the terrorist organizations, the various organizations like Lashkar and Jaish in Pakistan, which were also involved in the training camps and so on. And that relationship has been maintained to this very day. The Pakistan Inter-Services Intelligence is virtually a subsidiary of the CIA, and it acts on behalf of the CIA. And I should mention another very important dimension is that in 2001, in November 2001, and this was brought out in an article by Seymour Hersh, although he didn't really elaborate on the implications, is that Al-Qaeda combatants in Afghanistan were airlifted to northern Pakistan. They weren't sent to Guantanamo. Guantanamo was housed by civilians, people who were arrested left and right. The actual Al-Qaeda fighters were airlifted, and they were airlifted in military planes, and they were taken to northwest Pakistan, Waziristan, and that constitutes a new frontier, which today is the object of the drone attacks. So in other words, this is a very diabolical operation. You have to sustain these organizations as enemies of America, but also as assets. Now, an intelligence asset doesn't necessarily mean that these Islamic organizations know who their sponsors are. That's the whole point. An intelligence asset could be any one of us, okay? It's an instrument of US intelligence. And it goes through different layers. And in this case, Pakistan ISI was a very important relay in implementing US intelligence operations. Now, I think from my standpoint, and I focused mainly on geopolitics, I've focused on some other aspects of 9/11 which have been covered in these hearings, but the geopolitics of 10 years of war, that was in fact the theme of our conference in Montreal. 9/11 has unleashed a roadmap of war and destruction. We are at the crossroads of the most serious crisis in modern history. I think that's not an understatement. And the war on terrorism is part of that process, because it gives a justification to wage war on humanitarian grounds, so that you wage the war not against countries, but against what they called non-state entities, which came again into the jargon, and that I think is very important. It provided at each stage, Afghanistan, Iraq, of course, it was another pretext, but ultimately the war on terrorism was also fought on the basis of the fact that there were terrorists with dirty bombs and so on. If we remember Colin Powell's presentation to the Security Council of the United Nations in February, in February 2003, preceding the invasion of Iraq. And ultimately, the war on terrorism has been a continuum. what has happened is that this war on terrorism has also been supported by media fabrications. I think that 9/11 is the onslaught, and that's why 9/11 truth is so important. 9/11 is the onslaught of war propaganda, a higher level of war propaganda, where that actually happened immediately on the 12th of September. Okay? Immediately on the 12th of September, there were calls to invade Afghanistan from, what's his name, Sapphire, and various other pundits of the Washington Post and the New York Times, and said, yes, we must go after the terrorists. And all this has permeated the consciousness of millions of people. It's created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, which was then coupled with the coded alert, the color-coded alerts, and Homeland Security, and so on. And it was a pretext to wage a war without borders, which in essence is a war of conquest, and it was also a pretext to implement far-reaching changes at home through the Patriot legislation, through national security, protection of borders, and so on and so forth. And I mean, you might even remember when you board the plane with your Johnny Walker Black Label. I should mention a word about the liquid bomb attacks, because they were totally fabricated, among many others. But the liquid bomb attacks, it turned out that the alleged terrorists did not have passports and did not have tickets to board the plane. Now, they must have screwed up somewhere, to say the least. But in any event, we went through a whole era of threats, of attacks on America. Okay, attacks on America on the one hand, whereas in fact what was happening was large-scale theater wars waged by America against countries around the world in various forms, either theater wars or covert operations or regime changes, and all of this was carried out under the banner of fighting the outside enemy, the elusive enemy, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And as you know, we saw, first of all, we see Al-Qaeda in Iraq, then we see Al-Qaeda in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in Africa. We had subsidiaries of Al-Qaeda virtually everywhere, you know, and wherever the United States needed to intervene militarily, they used the pretext of Al-Qaeda in Yemen or Somalia or wherever, under different names, and of course corroborated by media reports, etc. And in all cases, I can assure you, these are instruments of US intelligence or MI6 or Mossad, and there's a collaboration between them. What I think is of concern to us is that the 9/11 big lie sets the stage for what I describe as the American Inquisition. The nature of an inquisitorial doctrine is very different to actual disinformation. There's a subtle difference, because media disinformation is that you hide the facts and you obfuscate certain things and you lie. An inquisitorial doctrine is quite different. You don't necessarily need to lie. You don't obfuscate the torture camps in Guantanamo. In fact, you do exactly the opposite. You make them visible. Why? Because ultimately they are accepted as something which we can do. So torture then is accepted because we need to go after the bad guys. Okay, and so that an inquisitorial doctrine is based on essentially on enforcing the lie as the truth. Okay, it's not by obfuscating the truth and saying, no, well, this, that, and other. It's actually inverting the truth. It's transforming the lie into the truth. And then what happens is that this becomes a consensus. Responsibility to protect in Libya is a consensus. But in reality, what is it? It's the killing of thousands of people. And we've been following this war, and I can assure you the reports that are published. Our correspondent of global research, Mali Darius Nazemroya, who's in this room at this moment, has reported back from Libya, and the atrocities committed by NATO have not been mentioned in any of the media. And responsibility to protect becomes the logo. It becomes something that we accept, and so on and so forth. And so an inquisitorial doctrine imposes itself as a consensus that you do not challenge, because it emanates from the highest authority of the land, not only from the head of state and the U.S. Congress, but from Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, from the from the ICC criminal courts, and so on. Everybody toes the line, and everybody is committed to going after bin Laden. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating. Let's say going after Al-Qaeda. But again, it's the war on terrorism, and then it's supported by and financed by Islamophobia, and so on and so forth. And 9/11 is the ultimate, it's like Adam picked the apple. So it's the starting point. It's the starting point of this discourse and dogma, which permeates every area of society. And it cannot be challenged. It cannot be challenged. It can certainly be challenged in terms of factual information, but then people dismiss those facts because the Inquisition does not allow you to accept the truth. And so what I'm saying here is that the lie becomes the truth, and the truth ultimately becomes a conspiracy to challenge that consensus. And there's a NATO consensus now in Libya.